Hi, my name is Luke. Today I want to start out with a question. Have you ever held a grudge on someone? I know in my family there are a lot of grudges, especially because of the three gingers, which are all girls, by the way, so there's that. Their heads have literal balls of fire on them, so things get a little heated. What about you? Have you ever held a grudge against someone who hurt you? Maybe it was a coworker. Maybe it was a family member. Maybe you're even mad at God. Well, I know Jonah has a few grudges, especially with the Ninevites. If you'd like to read with me, you can turn to Jonah 4. But to Jonah, this seemed very wrong. He became angry. He prayed to the Lord, "Isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? That is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you were a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger, and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live." But the Lord replied, "Is it right for you to be angry?" Jonah had gone out and sat down at a place east of the city. There he made himself a shelter, sat in its shade, and waited to see what would happen to the city. Then the Lord provided a leafy plant and made it grow up over Jonah to give shade for his head, to ease his discomfort, and Jonah was very happy about this plant. But at dawn the next day, God provided a worm, which chewed the plant so that it withered. When the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head, so that he grew faint. He wanted to die, and said, "It would be better for me to die than to live." But God said to Jonah, "Is it right for you to be angry with the plant?" "It is," he said, "and I'm so angry I wish I were dead." But the Lord said, You have been concerned about this plant, that you did not tend it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight and died overnight. And should I not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people, who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and also many animals? At the beginning of Jonah's story, we see God telling Jonah to preach to Nineveh, who, by the way, are the Israelites' biggest enemies. Jonah tries to run away from God, and after a various turn of events, he ends up in the belly of a big fish. He repents, and the fish spits him out, and God gives him a second chance to preach to Nineveh. So Jonah tells Nineveh that they will be destroyed in 40 days, but instead, God gives them grace. Now this is where Jonah gets mad. But why is he mad? I mean, how would you feel if God just handed grace to everyone that were your enemies? Just think about that for a second. I mean, I know I would be mad if it were me. But what about you? Well, I think Jonah is mad because he believes he deserves all of God's grace. And he's not willing to share any with the Ninevites because of how evil they are. So he has a grudge with them. Here are 3 things he can do to lose his selfishness and the anger or grudge that he may be holding on to. The first thing is that Jonah needs to give God control. I say this because Jonah thinks he's in charge of how much grace God gives to his enemies. I mean, it's almost like when an older brother does one brother does something wrong but receives grace, and when the older brother does something wrong, they get punished. And I think I know a lot about that, because my younger brother is 8 years younger than me, and sometimes I think he gets all the grace. Jonah's story is also a lot like the prodigal son, especially because Jonah is 100% the older brother, and thinks that his father is being unfair because none of the Ninevites had to work for their grace. Jonah also needs to work on practicing what he preaches. His hypocrisy is shown throughout the book, but especially during the episode of the shady plant. Remember that plant God took away? This shows that Jonah is a hypocrite, because he is perfectly fine with God ripping the only hope of salvation for the Ninevites, but he gets boiled with anger to the point of death when God takes his shady plant. Finally, Jonah also definitely needs some work on his ability to share God's grace. We see that Jonah is very selfish throughout the book, especially in the 4th chapter. He would rather die than do what God asks of him. 3 times he asks for death, just in the 4th chapter. 3 times. Jonah is also selfish because he thinks he deserves all of God's grace and is not willing to share it. In conclusion, I want you to think about something for a minute. Jonah ends up in a very abrupt cliffhanger, and it never really shows if he turned to God's ways or put his grudges behind him. His story just kind of stops. What about your story? What would you do? Would you give God control? Would you look at your own mistakes? And would you be selfish and try and have all the grace to yourself? Would you do what God asks? Or would you rather die than to share God's grace with your enemy?